Thank you, Dr. Carson, for a wonderful introduction. And also thank you for coming to this conference, meeting to listen. And I would like to dedicate this address to Siberi Desalegn. She was the first Ethiopian female student who was gunned down at Addis Ababa University in May of 2007 by Zenawi forces. And I also would like to dedicate this to Itukan Medeksa. She was also, she formed the Unity for Justice and Democracy Party. She was jailed by Zenawi regime for life, actually. And she is now joined with bedrock. And of course, I also would like to dedicate to more than the 2,000, I call the martyrs of the revolution, who were killed during the July demonstrations against 2005 demonstrations against the fraudulent elections in Ethiopia. Now, Ethiopia, I mean, there's something maddening about the Zenawi regime. You remember, Mengistu married. Now, this was a guy who, back in 1974, for example, he withdrew Haile Selassie and set up a very brutal regime. And under his reign, hundreds of thousands of people were gunned out just because they were counter-revolutionary. And more than 3,000 people were jailed by Mengistu. And when one of his own lieutenants questioned the wisdom of such terror tactics, he shot him in the head. And you may recall that in 1985, when there was famine in Ethiopia, Mengistu spent $200 million to celebrate the 10th anniversary of Soviet imperialism in Ethiopia. When people were dying, children were dying. Ethiopia, Mengistu and his henchmen were consuming Scotch whiskey, lobster, caviar, crates of caviar. Okay. And they even spent $10 million to redecorate the statues of Marx, Lenin, and Engels in Addis Ababa. But we fought him tooth and nail and drove him out of Ethiopia in 1991. But then, what did we get? Africans have a saying: we struggle very hard to remove one cockroach from power, and then the next rat comes to do the same thing, and even worse. Now, Africa, as Dr. Casa said, is poor because she's not free. And Ethiopia is a classic affirmation of that statement. Out of the 54 African countries, only 15 of them are democratic. Ethiopia is not one of them. As a matter of fact, Ethiopians have endured 35 years, in fact, more than 35 years of brutal repression. That is the longest spell in modern African history. Out of the 54 African countries, only 10 of them can be classified as economic success stories. Ethiopia is not one of them. And also fewer than 10 African countries can be said to have a free and independent media. Ethiopia is not one of them. Now, something has gone fundamentally wrong in Africa. Now, one of the things which I like to focus on is that Ethiopia is the headquarters of the African Union. It is one of the most useless organizations that we have on the continent. It is a den of unrepentant despots. The African Union can't even define democracy. There is no election that the African Union doesn't like. It certifies all elections as free and fair. Name me one single crisis that the African Union has resolved. Where was the African Union when Tunisia and Egypt blew up? Where was the African Union when Ivory Coast descended into chaos? And where is the African Union over Libya? And where was the African Union when Zimbabwe was slaughtering Ethiopians in the streets? Where was the African Union? There's only one thing the African Union can do with distinction, and that is hold annual jamborees where champagne glasses click as dictators pat themselves on the back for how long they have been in power. I think Ethiopia should seriously consider whether they should shut down the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa or throw it out. The African Union doesn't serve the interests of Ethiopians, nor does the African Union serve the interests of Africans. Now, my address to you today is not about the African Union, it's about the march for freedom. And thank you. It's about the march for freedom and how to rid Africa of dictators. Now, we can spend all day having conferences and talking about dictators, but that's not going to solve many of our problems. And as a matter of fact, one of the things that we need to do is re-examine our strategies. Fighting for freedom is a long and arduous task. It requires dedication, it requires determination, and it also requires unwavering focus. Too often, many of us give up too easily. But we need to stay on focus. Now, if you have to win, okay, we must be prepared to change some of our strategies. And also we must be prepared to change our way of thinking. Now, to begin with, in changing our way of thinking, think of a dictatorship as this way. For every force, there is a counterforce. A force dominates if the counterforce is weak or non-existent. Now, dictators have proliferated and dominated the African scene for decades because the counterforce is weak. Now, there are three ways of fighting a dictatorship. The first way is to try and persuade a dictator to change his brutal and tyrannical and horrific ways. That's one way of doing it. The other way is to strengthen the opposition so that the opposition will have a fighting chance. And the third way, of course, is to do both. Now, if you take a look at the first way, okay, we have tried everything. We have shamed the dictators. We have exposed their corruption and human rights abuses. We have written tons and tons, volumes, but Zimbabwe is not changing. It's sticking to his guns. See, the dictators are impervious to reason. We can't reason with them. Now, we can sit here today and we can talk about all the atrocities in our ways the regime is committed. We can talk about all the human rights violations, but that's not going to move this march for freedom forward. Now, what I would like to do is to focus on the opposition, how we can strengthen the opposition. Now, one of the reasons why we haven't made much progress, now remember this, in 1990, only 4 African countries were democratic. 1990. Now move forward, okay, to today. Okay. That's 21 years. Only 15. The progress has been slow. Okay. Why? The main reason is because the opposition is weak. In many countries in Africa, the opposition is fragmented and they're prone to bickering, and their strategy is ineffective. I'm saying this out of experience. We struggled very hard in Ghana, and we finally managed to get rid of a dictator. And if we can do it in Ghana, you can also do it in Ethiopia. But the first thing we have to recognize is that the opposition is weak. In Ethiopia, you have more than 90 political opposition parties and groups. Too many. In Cameroon, there are over 200 opposition parties. Now, obviously, Paul Biya is going to win the November 2011 elections. And even if, take a look at Kenya. In Kenya, they finally managed to pull all the opposition parties together to form an orange democratic movement. But then guess what? 2 months before the December 2007 elections, that coalition or alliance split. Same thing happened in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe managed to pull the opposition parties together into the Movement for Democratic Change, MDC. But then 3 months before the 2008 elections, that movement split. And it has also further split into 3. Nothing delights a dictator more than to see that the forces arrayed against him have split. Nothing. Now, obviously, the first rule is that we have to unify the opposition forces to fight a common enemy. This is not a time to preach what type of economic policy Ethiopia needs, what type of religion Ethiopia needs. The first thing is to get rid of that, Zenawi regime. That's the first thing. That is what must unite all opposition forces. After that, there are also 3 cardinal rules that we must follow. The first one is that you have to set up a nerve or brain center. You have to have a small group of people. You may call that group of people the Elders Council. See, there are many opposition groups. As a matter of fact, there are more than 200 of them in Ethiopia and also in the diaspora. All the activities, this Elders Council has to coordinate the activities of all of them. You don't want to have opposition parties working at cross purposes at each other. And also you have to plan strategically and also think tactically. And this is the function of the Elders Council or a nerve center. We formed one in Ghana in 1995. We called it the Alliance for Change. Now that Alliance for Change was made up of just 10 people. 10 people, I was one of them. And that Alliance for Change, we took an oath and a covenant that none of us was going to use that group to advance the political interests of either ourselves or any other group or party. Now that group, that Elders Council, must be apolitical. They must eschew any political ambition that they may have. And they may also not carry no political baggage. They must be able to reach out to all the opposition groups and also the youth movement, civil society groups and so forth, so that they can plan and think tactically. It's important, a nerve center. We set one up in Ghana. We also set one up here in North America, in the US, so that we can coordinate the activities. Now that nerve center can come up with a plan. The plan being that, all right, in Ghana, what we did was we targeted the media. The media was our first target. Now, the media is the most powerful weapon against all dictatorships. And you got to wrestle control of the media out of the hands of that clutches of that dictator. Take a look at Ethiopia. What's the state of the media there? Only one television station, 3 independent radio stations, and also Radio Ethiopia. You also have to know their strengths and weaknesses. One of the weaknesses is that their security forces are only small. I mean, if you take the military, in any African country, any military in any African country is less than 1% of the population. So you take advantage of that particular. You see, the military is offensively superior in weapons, but they are geographically and numerically inferior. So you exploit that weakness by stretching them. Okay? Now, you shut down the civil service and any military regime will collapse. Why? Because there are not enough soldiers to fill the civil servants' positions. Now, that particular tactic was on display in much of Tunisia and Egypt, when protesters held simultaneous protests in all cities across the country. This way they stretched security forces. So you see, you don't hold demonstrations only in Addis Ababa. You stretch the security forces. Now remember this, all dictators operate like a table. You don't fight a dictator on the table on which is strongest. You identify the props, and like a table, you cut the props, and then the dictator itself will come crashing down. The dictatorship itself will come crashing down. There are external and internal props. The external props include diplomatic recognition, foreign aid, loans. The Zimbabwe regime receives something like $1 billion a year in foreign aid. You find a way by which you can cut that. One of the ways by which you can cut that is to apply the odious debt principle. The odious debt principle says that any foreign loan to any illegitimate government constitutes an odious debt for which you cannot hold the people responsible to repay. The US applied this law, this doctrine, in 1898 when it took control over Cuba, and the Spanish government demanded that the US repay Spanish debt, and the US refused. In 1923, Costa Rica also applied the same odious debt. And I'm saying this because Ethiopians should also apply this. In 1990, the government of Bangladesh, military government of Bangladesh, the opposition parties applied this particular law. They warned foreign donors that any loan to that military dictator, Hussein Shah, would never be paid back. Guess what happened? The donors withheld funds, and that regime collapsed 2 weeks later. It is time to warn the Chinese. It is time to warn the Western donors operating in Ethiopia. This particular odious debt principle. Now, the media also, as I indicated, the media was also another important part of the props of the dictatorship. And then we have the professional class. For far too long, we've had members of my own profession, professors, who have sold their integrity and conscience to serve the dictates of barbarous regimes. I call them intellectual prostitutes and collaborators. Those are the people who also tend to support the dictatorship that we've had in many African countries. Trying to warn them. One of the things that we do is, we expose them. We print their names and we publish that, on the website and on the internet. And we shame them and we warn them. Any professor, of course, professors should understand what democracy is. Professors should understand what accountability is. Any professor who serves a regime that does not abide by the rule of law, of course, that profession has no place in teaching in the University of Addis Ababa. And that's why we should place them on notice. Now, this is what I mean being proactive and also fighting back. And finally, I'd like to indicate to you, Zenawi says that what's happening in Ethiopia and Egypt is not going to affect, what's happening in Tunisia and Egypt is not going to, Arab Spring is not going to have any effect in Ethiopia. He lies bad. Change will come to Ethiopia and we're going to defeat him in our way. Because better, that is enough of his rule in Ethiopia. Thank you very much.
St. Louis, Missouri. Thanks to Catherine Dunham for giving my pops his glory. He came down with his drum and a dream to change the world in a free, uplifting